The rain came down in a steady drizzle as Daniel Hayes tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his tired eyes scanning the road ahead. His gas gauge hovered just above empty, a cruel reminder of how tight money had become. He let out a slow breath, trying to ignore the tight knot of anxiety in his stomach. Rent was overdue, his son's school fees were piling up, and the hours at the auto repair shop had been cut again. He had no idea how he was going to make it through the month. "Dad, I'm hungry," a small voice piped up from the back seat. Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror at his 7-year-old son, Jake, bundled up in his too-thin hoodie. He forced a smile. "I know, buddy. We'll grab something soon." "Can we get burgers?" Daniel hesitated, calculating the loose bills in his wallet. "We'll see what we can do, all right." Jake nodded, trusting his father's word, even if Daniel himself wasn't sure how he'd make it happen. As he turned onto a quieter stretch of road on the outskirts of town, he spotted a figure walking along the shoulder, shoulders hunched against the rain. The man looked older, his jacket worn thin, his steps slow and unsteady. There was a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and something about the way he moved made Daniel's gut twist. He pulled up beside the man and rolled down the window. "Hey, you need a ride." The man turned, his face lined and weathered, his gray beard damp from the rain. His tired eyes met Daniel's, cautious but hopeful. "Depends," the man said, his voice rough. "How far you goin'?" "Where do you need to be?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "Trying to get back to Columbus. I was visiting an old friend, but my plans fell apart." Daniel nodded toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." The man hesitated only a second before tossing his bag in the back and climbing in. He let out a long sigh, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Appreciate it. Name's Frank Lawson." "Daniel, and that's my son Jake." Jake gave a small wave from the backseat. "Hi." Frank nodded, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Hey, kid." Daniel pulled back onto the road. "So, Columbus, huh? That's a ways off." "Yeah," Frank muttered. "I was supposed to catch a bus, but he shook his head. Doesn't matter, life happens." Daniel understood that all too well. He debated for a moment before saying, "I can't take you all the way there, but can get you closer to a bus station." Frank exhaled heavily, nodding. "That'd be more than I had 5 minutes ago. Thank you." Silence settled in for a moment before Frank glanced at Jake. "How old's the little man?" "7," Jake answered before Daniel could. "I like dinosaurs." Frank chuckled. "Good choice. Dinosaurs are tough, you got a favorite?" "Triceratops. They don't look scary, but they can fight back." Frank nodded. "Smart thinking, kid. Sometimes the toughest ones aren't the biggest or the meanest, just the ones who don't give up." Daniel glanced at Frank, something about those words striking a chord. "You a military man?" Frank gave a small nod. "Served 20 years, Army, been out for a while now, but..." He trailed off, staring out the window. "Some things stick with you." Daniel didn't press. He knew when a man had ghosts he didn't want to talk about. A few miles down the road, Daniel spotted a diner up ahead. His stomach growled at the sight of it, and he knew Jake must be starving. He debated stopping, knowing they didn't have much to spare, but then he glanced at Frank. The man looked exhausted. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. Frank hesitated but nodded. "I won't say no." Daniel pulled into the parking lot. "Come on, Jake, let's get something warm." Inside, they found a booth near the window. A waitress came over, smiling warmly at Jake as she handed them menus. "What can I get you boys tonight?" Jake's eyes lit up. "Can I get a burger, Dad?" Daniel smiled tiredly. "Yes, buddy, go ahead." Frank looked hesitant as he scanned the menu. "Just coffee for me," he muttered. Daniel shook his head. "Get something real, my treat." Frank gave him a long look before nodding. "All right, thank you." The food came, and for a while the three of them just ate, the warmth of the diner a welcome break from the cold rain outside. Frank ate slowly, like a man who hadn't had a proper meal in a while. After a while, Frank cleared his throat. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "You needed help. I know how that feels." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, get that." As they finished eating, Daniel paid the bill, cringing slightly at the total, but knowing it was worth it. He had just enough left to fill his gas tank enough to get them home. Back in the car, Daniel drove in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the windshield. "You got family in Columbus?" he asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Yes, my daughter. Haven't seen her in a long time." Daniel didn't push, but he could hear the weight in the man's voice. After another hour, they reached a small bus station. Daniel pulled up and put the car in park. "This should get you the rest of the way." Frank nodded, but he didn't move right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Daniel said simply. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He scribbled something on it and handed it to Daniel. "If you ever need help," Frank said, his voice serious, "you call me. I mean it." Daniel took the paper, glancing at the phone number written on it. Frank got out of the car, grabbing his bag. He turned back one last time, giving a small nod. "You take care, Daniel, and you too, kid." Jake waved. "Bye, Mr. Frank." As they pulled away, Daniel glanced at the paper in his hand, tucking it into his pocket. He didn't think he'd ever use it. But life had a way of surprising people. The drive home was quiet, except for the sound of raindrops hitting the windshield. Jake had dozed off in the backseat, his head resting against the window. Daniel's thoughts, however, were far from settled. He glanced once at the folded slip of paper Frank had given him, still tucked into the console. He wasn't sure why he hadn't just tossed it aside he never expected to call. But something about Frank stuck with him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The gas station came into view, and Daniel pulled in, digging out the last of the bills from his wallet. He pumped just enough to get home and prayed it would last him through the next few days. The moment he stepped back into the car, the weight of reality settled onto his shoulders again. The diner meal had been worth it, but it had cost him. By the time they reached the apartment, Daniel carefully unbuckled Jake and carried him inside. The small two-bedroom space was dimly lit, the air cool from the lack of proper heating. The overdue notice for rent sat on the kitchen counter, right where he had left it that morning. He avoided looking at it as he set Jake down on the couch, pulling a blanket over him before sinking into the chair opposite him. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping in. The auto repair shop had been cutting hours for months, and with Jake's school expenses piling up, the financial strain had only worsened. He'd done everything he could: side jobs, cutting back on groceries, delaying bills where he could, but it never seemed to be enough. The next morning, Daniel woke early, careful not to disturb Jake as he got ready for work. His shift at the repair shop was barely 5 hours today, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Business had been slow, and customers were hesitant to spend money on repairs unless absolutely necessary. As expected, the day dragged. He spent most of it adjusting invoices and reorganizing tools rather than doing actual repair work. His boss, Greg, pulled him aside near the end of the shift, rubbing his neck as he hesitated. "Look, Daniel, I hate to do this, but we're cutting more hours next month. I'll try to keep you on as much as I can, but..." Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. He had seen it coming. "I get it. No hard feelings." Greg looked genuinely guilty. "If things pick up, you'll be the first one I call." Daniel forced a smile before heading out. He knew Greg meant well, but good intentions didn't pay rent. By the time he picked Jake up from school, the weight of everything was pressing down harder than ever. Jake chattered about his day, oblivious to his father's worries. Daniel did his best to listen, nodding at the right moments, but his mind was elsewhere. Back home, after Jake settled in with his homework, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the overdue notice again. He traced the edge of it with his thumb, debating his options. He could try asking for an advance, but with hours already cut, that wasn't likely. He could sell his old tools, but that would only help for a month at most. His gaze drifted to the folded slip of paper. He hesitated before reaching for it, unfolding it slowly. Frank's number was scrawled neatly across the page, along with a note beneath it. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate." Daniel tapped his fingers against the table, weighing the decision. He wasn't the type to ask for help, especially from someone he had just met, but something about Frank's words echoed in his mind. After a long moment, he picked up his phone. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "This is Frank." Daniel hesitated. "Hey, it's Daniel from the other night." A pause, then Frank's tone warmed. "Daniel, didn't expect to hear from you." "Yeah, Daniel rubbed his jaw, feeling foolish for even making the call. "Look, I'm not calling for a handout. I'm in a tight spot and I'm trying to figure things out. You said if I ever needed anything." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what's going on." Daniel hesitated, then sighed. He kept it brief, just the job cuts, the overdue rent, the struggle to keep up. He didn't expect anything to come from it, maybe just an ear to listen. Frank listened without interrupting, and when Daniel finished, there was a beat of silence before Frank spoke again. "Where do you live?" Daniel hesitated at the directness. Just outside of Dayton." Frank hummed, "You working tomorrow?" "Yes, for now." "All right, keep your phone close. I'll be in touch." Before Daniel could ask what that meant, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, unsure what to make of the conversation. The next day passed with little change. Work was slow, money was still tight, and Daniel found himself no closer to a solution. But just as he was about to pick up Jake from school, his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. He answered cautiously, "Hello." "Daniel Hayes." The voice was different from Frank's crisper, professional. "Yeah. This is Alan Lawson. My father Frank told me about you." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Your father?" "Yes, he mentioned the kindness you showed him the other night. He doesn't ask for help often, and he certainly doesn't offer it lightly. So when he told me about you, I listened." Daniel wasn't sure where this was going. "I appreciate that, but—" Alan cut in smoothly. "I run a logistics company. We're expanding our maintenance team and need reliable people. My father says you're good with your hands. If you're willing to relocate, I can offer you a position. Full-time, benefits included." Daniel's breath caught. "You're offering me a job?" "A stable one. Pays significantly better than what you're making now. And my father insists I do this properly, so I'll even cover your relocation expenses if you take the offer." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping his phone tightly. It sounded too good to be real. "Take the night to think it over," Alan said. "But if you're interested, we can set up the paperwork tomorrow." Daniel swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Alan replied, "and understand that this isn't charity. My father believes good people deserve breaks, and from what he's told me, you're one of them." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it." "Good, I'll be expecting your call." The line went dead, leaving Daniel standing there, heart pounding. Jake peeked around the corner. "Dad." Daniel turned, still processing. "Yeah, buddy." Jake frowned. "You look like you saw a dinosaur." Daniel let out a breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I did, kid. Maybe I did." Daniel stood in the dim kitchen, gripping his phone long after the call had ended. His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind racing through every possible scenario. A job offer. A real one. Not another month-to-month gig with no security, but something stable. Something that could change everything. But relocating, that was a different conversation entirely. Jake sat cross-legged on the couch, fiddling with a small plastic dinosaur. He wasn't aware of the storm of thoughts running through his father's head. Daniel watched him for a moment, then took a deep breath. He needed to be smart about this. That night, he barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing every factor. Leaving Dayton meant uprooting Jake from his school, starting fresh in an unfamiliar place. But staying meant continuing the same cycle of struggle. He could barely pay rent now. What would happen if his hours got cut even further? The sun was barely up when he made his decision. He dialed the number Alan had given him, his grip tight on the phone. It rang only once before the man picked up. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Alan's response was immediate. "Good choice. I'll send over the contract details this afternoon. Once everything is processed, we'll arrange the relocation." It was real. After the call, Daniel sat at the table, rubbing his hands together. He wasn't used to things working out like this. There had to be a catch, but Frank had been genuine, and Alan seemed like a man who meant what he said. Later that morning, Daniel met with his landlord. He explained his situation and asked about breaking the lease early. The man, though not overly sympathetic, was understanding enough. There would be a penalty fee, but with Alan covering relocation costs, Daniel figured he could manage. The hardest part was telling Jake. After school, Daniel sat him down, choosing his words carefully. "Buddy, we're moving." Jake's brows pulled together. "Like, to a new house." "To a new city," Daniel clarified. "I got a new job, one that's going to help us a lot. It means a fresh start." Jake's small fingers gripped the hem of his hoodie. "Will I have to leave my friends?" Daniel's stomach tightened. "Yeah, but you'll make new ones, and we'll be okay. Better than okay, actually." Jake was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Will we have more food?" The question nearly broke Daniel. He reached out, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, we will." The moving process was fast. Within a week, Alan's company had arranged everything: packing services, transportation, even temporary housing until Daniel could find a permanent place. It felt surreal, and Daniel kept waiting for something to go wrong. But it didn't. The first time he set foot in the new workplace, he was met with professionalism and efficiency. The garage was well equipped, the team experienced. Alan himself met Daniel in person, shaking his hand firmly. "My father doesn't call in favors often," Alan said. "So when he does, I know it's for someone worth investing in." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. The first paycheck was more than Daniel had ever earned in a single month before. He stared at the numbers on the stub, hardly able to believe them. For the first time in years, he could breathe. With the money, he was able to secure a solid apartment in a safe neighborhood. Jake's new school was close by, and within a few weeks, the boy had already started making friends. One evening, as Daniel sat on their small balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed. Frank's name lit up the screen. Daniel answered, a smile creeping onto his face. "Didn't expect to hear from you." Frank's voice was warm. "Figured I'd check in. How's the new life treating you?" Daniel glanced at the open sliding door, where Jake was setting up his dinosaurs on the coffee table, humming to himself. He exhaled, better than ever imagined. Frank chuckled, "Good, you earned it." Daniel didn't know if that was true. He had just done what any decent person would do. He had helped a man in need. But somehow, that simple act had led him here, to a future he hadn't dared to dream of before. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to be okay. Daniel adjusted quickly to his new job, though the pace was different from what he was used to. The logistics company had a well-organized system, and every mechanic had assigned tasks each day. Unlike his previous job, where work was inconsistent, here, there was always something to do. Trucks came in for maintenance on a strict schedule, and Daniel found himself learning new techniques alongside experienced workers. Alan checked in on him regularly but never hovered. It was clear he trusted Daniel to do the job well, and Daniel appreciated that. The pay was steady, and for the first time in years, he was able to put money aside instead of constantly scrambling to make ends meet. Jake had settled into his new school, and though Daniel knew moving had been a big adjustment for him, the boy never complained. Some evenings, Jake would excitedly talk about school projects or new friends while eating dinner. Daniel listened, grateful for the simple moments. One evening, as Daniel was finishing up at work, a familiar figure appeared at the garage entrance. Frank stood there, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching Daniel with a knowing smile. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "Didn't expect to see you here." Frank chuckled, figured it was time I checked in properly. They stepped outside, where the evening air was crisp. Frank leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. "How's it been treating you?" Daniel exhaled, still getting used to it. Feels strange not constantly worrying about bills. Frank nodded knowingly. "Took me a long time to adjust after I left the service. When you've been struggling for so long, stability feels foreign." Daniel considered that. "I guess I never really thought about it like that." Frank studied him. "You've done good, Daniel. You took a risk moving here, and it's paying off." Daniel glanced toward the parking lot, where his truck sat, the same one that had carried him and Jake through so many uncertain nights. "I didn't do it alone." Frank smiled faintly. "No, but you made the choice, that's what matters." Daniel had never been one to dwell on things, but standing there, he realized how much had changed in such a short time. He had taken a chance on helping a stranger, and in return, his life had taken a turn he never could have predicted. They stood in comfortable silence for a while before Frank finally pushed off the wall. "Come on, let me buy you a drink." Daniel smirked. "You sure? I remember you turning down food the first time we met." Frank chuckled. "Yeah, well, things change." They ended up at a small diner not far from the shop, one Frank claimed had the best coffee in town. They talked about everything except the past. Frank had a way of keeping conversations light, and Daniel found himself laughing more than he had in years. As they were finishing up, Frank leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. "You ever think about what's next?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Next?" Frank nodded. "You got stability now. You've got a good job, a roof over your head. But what's the next step?" Daniel hadn't thought much beyond just surviving. "I don't know, just making sure Jake has what he needs." Frank studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's a good answer, but don't forget yourself in the process." Daniel didn't respond right away. He had spent so long putting Jake first that he wasn't sure what it meant to think about his own future. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "Before you argue, just open it." Daniel hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a check, a significant one. His eyes widened. "Frank, what is this?" Frank's expression was unreadable. "Call it a thank you, from my family to yours." Daniel shook his head. "Can't take this." Frank leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "You can, and you will. You helped me when you had nothing to spare. This is just making sure you and Jake have a real chance." Daniel swallowed hard, emotions rising in his chest. He had never expected anything in return for that ride in the rain. He had only done what felt right. Frank smiled. Consider it an investment in your future." Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the check. He wasn't sure what he had done to deserve this kind of kindness, but he wasn't about to waste it. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond just getting by. Daniel sat in his apartment that night, the check Frank had given him still resting on the table in front of him. He had stared at it for nearly an hour, unable to fully wrap his head around the reality of what had happened. The amount written on it was life-changing, not enough to make him rich, but enough to give him something he hadn't had in years: security. It wasn't charity. Frank had made that clear. It was a thank you, a sign of gratitude for the simple act of kindness Daniel had shown on that rainy night, but accepting it still felt like a weighty decision. He glanced over at the couch, where Jake was curled up with a book, his small fingers tracing the pictures on the pages. The sight of his son, comfortable, safe, and unaware of the struggles that had haunted them for so long, made the decision easier. Daniel picked up his phone and dialed Frank's number. The older man answered quickly, his voice steady. "Figured I'd hear from you." Daniel exhaled, gripping the check in his free hand. "I don't know how to accept this." Frank chuckled. "You don't have to do anything except cash it." "I didn't do anything special," Daniel admitted. "I just gave you a ride and bought you a meal." "You gave me more than that," Frank said. "You treated me like a person when you didn't have to. That night, I had nothing. No way of getting home, no one expecting me. And you, someone who had every reason to look the other way, didn't. My son and I, we take care of our own, and after what you did, that includes you." Daniel let out a slow breath. He could argue all night, but Frank wouldn't budge. The man had made up his mind. "Use it wisely," Frank added. "Make sure you and that boy of yours have a future." Daniel nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. "I will." The next morning, Daniel took the check to the bank. The teller gave him a surprised look when she saw the amount, but Daniel simply nodded at her questioning glance. The deposit went through smoothly, and just like that, his account held more money than it ever had before. When he picked Jake up from school that day, he took him out for ice cream, a small celebration, nothing extravagant. As they sat on a bench outside the shop, Jake happily licking his cone, Daniel felt something settle in his chest. A relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking a financial tightrope. He could finally breathe. He made careful plans for the money. The first thing he did was pay off the last of the moving expenses that Alan's company hadn't covered. Then, he set aside a portion for Jake's future, something he had always wanted to do but never had the means for. Next came securing their future. He found a more spacious apartment in a neighborhood with good schools, making sure Jake would have the stability he deserved. He also replaced his aging truck with a reliable vehicle, ensuring he wouldn't have to worry about breakdowns every few months. But the most important thing he did was take a day off, something he had never allowed himself before. A full day spent with Jake, exploring the new city, visiting the zoo, and simply being present. For once, he wasn't preoccupied with stress or the next bill looming over him. A few months ago, he had been on the edge of losing everything. Now, he had a future, a real one. And all of it had started with a simple decision to help a stranger on a rainy night.